Hey everyone! Today let's dive into a piece of French history where the relationships are so tangled. They make your head spin. First, let's look at a simple little relationship diagram. France had a very famous king, Louis XIV. He had a younger brother, Philippe I. Philippe's wife was Henrietta, and Henrietta fell in love with Louis XIV. Feeling a bit complicated? It gets worse. Philippe had a male lover, the Chevalier de Lorraine. Lorraine also had a lover, a woman named Catherine Charlotte de Gramont. And guess who Catherine's lover was? You guessed it, Louis XIV. But wait, there's more. The lover of Louis XIV's lover, Henrietta, was Catherine's brother, Guillaume de Gramont, and Guillaume de Gramont? He was also Philippe's lover. It is even possible that Philippe's lover, Lorraine, and Philippe's other lover, Gramont, were lovers themselves. Sounds completely outrageous, right? From Gramont's perspective, it's like, I am the lover of my lover's lover's lover. For Henrietta, it's my husband's lover is also my lover. How can we even begin to understand this? Is it reasonable? Does it make any sense at all? Believe it or not, it does. And to understand this reasonable yet absurd situation, we have to talk about one key figure, Louis XIII, as we've mentioned before in the old European social system. Nobles generally saw marriage as a practical tool, and lovers as their true love. The saying went, just because I'm married doesn't mean I'm in love, and just because I'm in love doesn't mean I'll get married. Because marriage and romance were completely separate. If a European noble said, I don't have a lover, what others heard was, I'm poor, I'm ugly, I have no true love, and I have no will to live. Even worse, he might be labeled as gay. So, for a noble, even if their marriage was happy, they still needed to keep a few lovers on the side to prove their sexual orientation and social status. But King Louis XIII was an exception. Why didn't he have a lover? Because, for a king, Louis XIII had a small issue. He just wasn't interested in women. Now this creates a problem. If the king has no interest in the queen, what about the throne? Where would the heir come from? Luckily, Louis XIII had a younger brother, Gaston. So even if he didn't have kids, the succession wouldn't be affected. Unfortunately, Gaston's performance was, let's say, a bit bizarre. Later generations described him as not stupid, just not very smart. During Louis XIII's reign, the king wanted to centralize power and weaken the nobility. The nobles, in turn, pinned their hopes on Gaston, trying to use his name to oppose the king. So what was Gaston's attitude? He basically said, rebellion? Easy. I can do it any time. He completely forgot he was the first in line to the French throne and eagerly joined the rebel alliance. In 1626, he and the Count of Chalais plotted a rebellion. It failed before it even started. Chalais was executed. In 1632, he rebelled again with the Duke of Montmorency. As soon as they raised their army, they were defeated. Montmorency was executed. In 1634, he defected to the enemy state of Lorraine and even married a Lorraine princess. But then Lorraine was occupied, and the Duke of Lorraine lost his lands. Because Gaston was such a disaster, Louis XIII, the king who had no interest in women, was forced to frequently visit the queen's bedroom. Eventually, he managed to create a new heir, the future Louis XIV. But even after Louis XIV was born and took the throne, Gaston just kept on rebelling. In 1648, Paris was in chaos. Gaston first joined the nobles to oppose the royal power. The nobles were suppressed. Then he switched to the king's side to defend royal power. The nobles made a comeback. Then he joined the nobles again to oppose royal power. And the nobles were suppressed again. Gaston's lifetime of rebellion and the nobles' constant uprisings left a huge trauma on the young Louis XIV. He realized he couldn't trust the royal family, the nobility, the army, or the church. So who could he trust? The answer, it seemed, was his lovers. They became his only choice. There was another reason Louis XIV chose lovers: his unique style of governance. You could almost say he ruled as if he were doing a live broadcast. What does that mean? Louis XIV called himself the Sun King. To show off his solar status, he built the incredibly luxurious Palace of Versailles and gathered all the nobles to live there with him. What did they do all day? Performance art. Louis XIV had about 8 major ceremonies every single day. In the morning, you had the Grand Rising ceremony, followed by the Small Rising ceremony at 9 a.m. Mass. At 1 p.m., the lunch ceremony, then the audience ceremony, the dinner ceremony, And finally, the bedtime ceremony. What were these ceremonies? The rising ceremony was a crowd of people staring at Louis XIV waking up. The bedtime ceremony was a crowd staring at him going to sleep. His outfits for these events were also special. High heels, wigs, white stockings, lace pants. He had about 2,000 sets. Why do all this? Two main reasons. First, to establish authority. Wherever he walked, all eyes were on him. The nobles tried to imitate his style, which drained their finances. The ceremonies reinforced the hierarchy. Who could help the king dress? Who could hand him his scepter? It was all decided by rank. This created divisions among the nobles. Second, to strengthen surveillance. By keeping the nobles at Versailles, their local political power struggles were brought inside the palace, making it easier to watch them and break up their factions. To further assert his authority, Louis XIV launched wars, taking military and administrative powers back to the crown. But because he couldn't get too close to the nobles, he needed a buffer. Lovers were the perfect buffer. Their backgrounds were easier to control, and different lovers could represent different factions. At Versailles, a person's power was defined by what they were allowed to do, where they could sit and where they could go. Louis XIV emphasized ritual, not morality. This naturally elevated the status of his lovers. If Louis XIV favored a lover too much, she became his representative. And if that lover faced opposition, he could cut ties with her immediately. A noble's lover could become the king's lover. The king's lover could become a noble's lover. This wasn't seen as the king stole someone's wife. It was more like, congratulations, you married today's royal consort. And so, to endure the suffering and bear the infamy of his political strategy, Louis XIV officially appointed 3 main lovers, had 10 to 15 short-term ones, and successfully achieved absolute monarchy. But what was the cost? The cost was that nobles and ministers would stop at nothing to flatter the king or those close to him. In theory, that sounds good. But stopping at nothing went way too far and damaged the monarchy's image. 2 incidents illustrate this perfectly. First, the Françoise de Montespan affair. Montespan was Louis XIV's favorite lover. Whenever he was with her, he felt an uncontrollable passion. Was it love? It felt magical. But he soon discovered the real reason. In 1677, a series of poisoning cases rocked the Parisian nobility. The chief of police, La Reynie, investigated and found that all clues pointed to a woman named Lavoisienne. She sold 2 best-selling products, inheritance powder, which was poison, and love potions, which were aphrodisiacs. And one of her biggest clients was Louis XIV's favorite Montespan. The king discovered that someone was poisoning him, someone was feeding him aphrodisiacs, and someone was doing both. The second incident was the Vermandois affair. Louis de Bourbon, Count of Vermandois, was Louis XIV's illegitimate son. He inherited from his uncle Philippe's side a disinterest in women. Since the king's brother liked men, many people catered to this preference as a way to get closer to the king. One of these people was the Chevalier de Lorraine, Philippe's lover. He created a group called the Italian Brotherhood, whose purpose was to find like-minded friends and form their own political faction. If someone didn't share their preferences, they would cultivate those preferences in them. And the young Count of Vermandois was one of their targets. What did this mean? It meant corruption and decadence. Although illegitimate children had no right to inherit, the investigation revealed that many members of the royal family and nobility were involved. We don't know if it included other relatives of Louis XIV, especially potential future heirs, because Louis XIV completely sealed the case files. After these 2 scandals, Louis XIV suddenly gave up his life of pleasure. There was another reason for this change. He ran out of money. The luxury of Versailles and endless wars had destroyed France's finances. And as an aging performer, the constant high-intensity ceremonial life had taken a toll on his body and spirit. From that point on, the question, where will the money come from, plagued the entire Bourbon dynasty. Louis XIV couldn't solve it, Louis XV couldn't solve it, and Louis XVI didn't have the brains to solve it. And that, ultimately, is how the Bourbon dynasty came to an end. That's all for today's story. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more.